It is my pleasure to see everybody out for this stimulating talk this morning. I think you will find Brad's discussion very enlightening. I have known Brad for many years, from when I was working in Washington in the Pentagon and then in the NNSA, and Brad is one of the leading experts on nuclear policy, non-proliferation, nuclear weapons policy, and has been for many years through his work in Washington at the Institute for Defense Analysis and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and now in our own backyard, so to speak, as the Director of Global Security for the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Brad is also has Reno heritage, so he got to come home, sort of. His parents lived across the street from Ty Cobb's brother, so it's a small community. So luckily, the reason we're here on a Monday is that Brad asked if he could come over for the weekend and present on a Monday. So we are thrilled to have one of the leading experts in policy work, national security policy work, nuclear policy work, and today he will be talking to us about the role of allies and alliances for the United States. You've heard a lot of mention of that from previous speakers, that the U.S. needs and relies on our allies. This is your opportunity to get a deep dive on those comments and to really hear more about what that means in practice. So with that, welcome Brad Roberts.
Thanks, Maureen. Thank you to all of you for carving out time in busy life schedules to stay informed about national security affairs. Congratulations to Ty Cobb and to the rest of the leadership group that created this venue and keeps this dialogue going, and I'm pleased to be a part of it today. Allies and alliances. When Maureen asked if I'd be interested to come up and give a chat, I said, of course I'd love to talk about nuclear policy, because that's what I do. And she said, well, we've had a lot of people talking about nuclear policy. And we've had an unfinished discussion a number of times about allies and alliances. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of both, because these subjects are inherently tied together today. And where I'll start is by, first of all, giving you a little historical context and background on our allies and alliances, so that we have a common factual basis to discuss the next set of policy questions that are on the table today. I had the pleasure and honor of serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy from 2009 to 2013. And in that time, I led the Obama administration's nuclear posture review. And at the start of the review, we decided it would be useful and interesting to solicit the views of the stakeholders and America's answers to these questions. So among the stakeholders, of course, are our allies. So I turned to my State Department colleague and said, so who are our allies? How many allies do we have? And the answer was, well, it depends on what you want to count. Mr. Putin was an ally of the United States in the war on terror from remember when George Bush stood atop the rubble and said, choose. Putin was the first one to call him that night. And he was referred to as an ally on the war on terror. We have in the Persian Gulf, quote, non-NATO major allies, Bahrain, where we have a military base, for example. But these are not states with which we have a mutual defense written down treaty. We're using the slides we're using the screens at the front. I've got just a couple of maps to give you some sense of our allies, our formal treaty partners in Europe and Northeast Asia. This is, of course, the North Atlantic Alliance, which began in 1949 with just a handful of countries, 14, now has 30 members, has expanded in 4 waves, most recently with the addition of Montenegro, not much of a contribution to the alliance's overall defense strategy, but since the end of the Cold War, the alliance has expanded a number of times rather than contracting and going away, because the Allies have wanted, and we have wanted, to pursue a Europe whole and free, is the shorthand. And in Northeast Asia, we have, in East Asia, we have 7 allies. We all remember, usually, Japan and South Korea. Philippines remains an ally. Australia is, of course, an ally, and some others in the region. And in the Middle East, we have these non-NATO allies and non-allies, major security partners. Whether Israel is formally an ally of the United States or not is an open question. Presidents have seen the answer to that question differently. So that's the cast of characters. Now, what's the president upset about? Let's start at what puts this topic on the table today. Why are we having a discussion about allies and alliances? Well, the president, here is his national security strategy, which says, among other things, some very important things about the role of allies in looking after our shared interests. The vitality of our alliances, and then the National Defense Strategy, which was prepared by Secretary Mattis, talks about the central role of allies in meeting the challenges of the new security environment. This new security environment defined primarily by the renewal of rivalry between the major powers, especially between the United States, Russia, and China. So the formal documentation of the administration says allies are important. Indeed, they're a central part of our national security strategy and our national defense strategy. But we all know the president moves to his own tune, often a tune that no one else in the administration has, and this is one of those areas. The president's got really 3 complaints about allies and alliances. The first is that they don't pay their fair share. This is an enduring political reaction to allies. I worked with Secretary Gates, who in his farewell address at NATO excoriated our NATO allies. He said, how can it possibly be that American taxpayers are willing to do more for the safety and security of your children than you are? So this is an enduring theme that allies don't pay enough. But this isn't simply a financial transaction. I'll come back to that. His second complaint is that allies are not just a burden to us, but they're a barrier to us, that they get in the way. That there are things we want to do. And here, bear in mind, this isn't just a complaint, again, of this president. You may recall the George W. Bush administration built coalitions of the willing, was the term of art in the period. This was a coalition of the willing to go after Saddam in 2002 and 3. But there was something called the coalition of the unwilling. The German and French governments came together to oppose the initiative of the Bush administration, so allies can be restraints on the exercise of American power when we see the need to go off and exercise power. Sometimes there are enablers, sometimes there are constraints. The third, did I end up with 3 on my list? Sorry, let me go back to my, a third argument is that when we go off and want to do something together with allies, they're like lemmings. They fly away. And we're left to do this alone. So if we can't count on them, why have them there as a part of this overall? Now, I've offered up a summary of the president's views that I think of as, I don't agree with them all, but I think they have deep roots, and they're a part of a long-standing set of complaints that the United States has had about allies. But there's an unprincipled dimension to this as well, it seems to me, which is we're not just asking our allies, this administration is not just asking our allies to pay their fair share, their share, there's a protection racket going on. We're saying, the president has said, so, you know, pay what you owe us, and then thank you, pay some more. We'll take an extra 50% on top. And you don't like it, too bad. Well, this is poisonous to alliances. Allies join with us in common projects because of their conviction and our conviction that we have common purposes. And if the president's view is, well, all we're doing really is engaging in a financial transaction and not looking after common interests and common purposes, then we have a different problem. And let me recall Maureen's comment in the invitation for this event, recalling George Washington, who reminds us that our deep roots as a political culture are to be removed, not be engaged in the mess of world politics. And this was our national strategic culture for 200 years or 150 years. And this will always be a part of us. We will always have a discussion about external roles and responsibilities because we feel part of our national heritage was to be created to be different from all of that. So I think the president and the administration have sent mixed messages on this question of allies and alliances. Some offering up some principled arguments, offering up one unprincipled argument, and offering up a traditional cultural way of thinking about this question of our relationships with our allies. What are the counter arguments to these complaints? And let me quickly move through 3 of them. The first, or 4 of them, sorry. The first is that the first 2 really come from our experience in the 20th century and the period of the second breakdown of world peace. So recall that in 1914, the then existing world order broke down into a massive war. In 1918 and 1919, the politicians of that time tried to create a new world order, built around the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. We chose not to engage as a nation. We stood apart. The League didn't really function. The agreements about the nature of the needed world order gave way to insecurity and aggression, and 20 years later we were back in another war. Those wars killed approximately 100 million people. And so there was some, and of course the second one ended with a big punctuation mark, the beginning of the nuclear era. And so very serious effort went in most countries to thinking about how did we build a more durable peace. And part of the way was to ensure that America stayed engaged. And the selfish argument from our national perspective was that engagement abroad kept the problem over there. If there was going to be, that we couldn't live in a world, we couldn't be safe in a world in which Europe or Asia were constantly at war, especially a world in which there were nuclear weapons and long-range missiles to deliver them. So the first counter-argument to we don't really need allies is that, well, for sustaining the peace in Europe and Asia, which helps keep America peaceful, we need allies and alliances. Second, and this is the world ordering project, which is the second interest we have, which is we in the 1930s we gave up on the existing world order. We engaged in isolationist policies, in competitive trade relationships, isolationism, and military disengagement. And the result was a world order that fell apart. So not only did we have an interest in keeping wars fought abroad, if they were going to be fought, but we had an interest in building an international order that would be durable, that would be peaceful, that would be viable because it would keep the problem of war at bay. But more than that, it would build on the common interests that we share with countries with whom we share values and interests in building a more enduring, peaceful order. And allies are a central part of that, and they're a central part of extending that order to deal with new challenges. This is a map from an Al-Qaeda website in 2005. quoting bin Laden at the top. Our intended goal in this age is the establishment of a caliphate. There are actually two maps here. The main big map is the world they envisioned 30 years later in 2035. And then there's a little map in the low, and what you'll see in that world is a green flag flying over the Ummah. The Ummah is a reference to the place that Muslims have practiced their faith. And this would have been restored fully to a single nation-state entity, but in a post-secular society. And then notice the little map in the lower right-hand corner. 100 years later, all green. The vision of a world that had been conquered or changed and brought to a new post-secular order, living according to Islamic law and custom and power. And for this problem, allies are darned relevant. The only time the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has declared an Article 5 contingency. Article 5 is the commitment in the North Atlantic Treaty when states parties say, I'm going to come to your defense if you need help. The only time that has been invoked in history was after 9/11. And the war in Afghanistan that we think of as a war of American sacrifice is a war in which our NATO allies and our East Asian allies participated heavily and lost many lives. So allies are important to problems like this, even if this wasn't what the alliance was created for. A third argument is, 1, 2, 3, is about meeting the need for posses. So in the international system that we've built after 1944, 45, 46, the United Nations was supposed to play a central role in providing for challenges to the peace. The League of Nations failed at this because it didn't have something like a Security Council. So in rebuilding the League, but calling it the United Nations in 1946, a Security Council was created. And the Security Council has 5 permanent members who are the major powers at the time, and then a rotating group of another 10 or so who come on board. And their job is to look after major challenges to the peace. How's that work for us? Not so well. And so if we're going to deal with major challenges to the peace that erupt in one region or another, it's going to take a sheriff and a posse, coalitions of the willing, so to speak. This is a mock, well, it's a book cover, but it plays off the movie High Noon. But if you notice what's in the holster, they're not 6-shooters, they're nuclear weapons. And in standing down the problem of nuclear-armed challengers like Saddam, Kim Jong-un, and potentially the regime in Tehran, we want all the help we can get. We don't want to be the lone sheriff standing in the street at the end of the day having to face down nuclear-armed bad guys alone. We never want it to get to that point. Allies are a part of the solution to this problem. And lastly, burden sharing. Well, I'm a slide off, but that's okay. It's a good slide to look at. Burden sharing, broadly defined. You know, the president has put his spotlight on, are our NATO allies paying the 2% of their GDP for defense that they promised? Well, that's sort of an odd metric, it seems to me. First of all, there are lots of things in the military realm today that don't cost the money of building tanks and navies and air forces. We're competing in cyberspace. We're competing in outer space. A lot of the competition we're doing is in technical realms with private sector partners. I'm not sure cost is the first metric that we should use when we're considering the sharing of burden that we do with our allies. From the nuclear business, the burden I want our allies to share is the following. If ever there is a moment when the American president has to decide whether or not to employ a nuclear weapon on behalf of an ally, we want that ally at the table. We want the other allies at the table. This will be the most momentous decision made in the 21st century. We want to share that burden. The responsibility is ours, but we want to share that burden. This is a different way of thinking about burden sharing than the one we come to when we ask, have you paid your bill this week? Now let me say lastly about this debate about allies. This is also a substitute for a debate about something else, which is American leadership. How do we as a nation think about exercising leadership in our role in the 21st century? And there are basically three different views in this debate today. One is the view best articulated by former Vice President Dick Cheney, who said, we exercise leadership by generating followership when we exercise power. Other nations will know that we have sufficient power and sufficient will to get something done, and they will want to side with us because they know we're going to be victorious. They're choosing the winning side. That's leadership. That's one view. A view of the administration of which I was a part was you build leadership by building a common view of the problem that you and your allies are facing. We spent a lot of time in the first 18 months of the Obama administration talking about, with allies in Northeast Asia, talking about North Korea, and with allies in Europe talking about the changing Russian threat. Then we talked about what we were going to do about this. What was our common agenda? And the common agenda included giving more and more responsibility to allies to stand up and exercise leadership of their own. This then got attacked as, quote, leadership from behind by the United States. We're asking others to do the work of leadership. And thus I find it doubly ironic that the proponents of that way of thinking, that was leadership from behind, are now in the current administration and representing the third way of thinking, which is leadership. That's a nice 20th century idea. And if you read the Trump administration's national security strategy, so every new administration when they arrive is obliged by law to write a national security strategy, unclassified. It's posted at the White House website. You can read all of them since this obligation was created in 1982. And they all talk about leadership. They're all visions of American leadership, except for this one. And other than the cover letter from the president on page 1 of the Trump national security strategy, you don't find the word leadership until you come to the chapter on economic relations, where leadership is exercised through economic nationalism. There is no talk in the section on diplomacy, in the section on security strategies. It's not about the exercise of leadership, it's the exercise of nationalist policies. So 3 different visions, and allies obviously fit into these visions in different ways. Let me, in the last 10 minutes or so, turn to some arguments about the current challenges facing our alliances. And again, I'm going to, this time I'm going to talk about 5. The first challenge is that Russia and China really don't like them. Russia and China say, these are Cold War things that you've kept around in the 21st century. What other possible reason could you have to keep them other than for us, other than to get us? And both Putin and President Xi Jinping have given talks repeatedly in the last 3, 4, 5 years about the ways in which the United States has maintained these alliance structures from the Cold War in order to encircle and contain Russia or China, depending on which capital you're sitting in order to prevent their return and rise to their rightful place to power in a multipolar international system. I've got the quote here from President Putin's speech to the Russian parliament of 5 years ago. This was the speech in which he announced the annexation of Crimea that began that same day. But the United States and its allies, quote, they are constantly trying to sweep us into a corner. There's a limit to everything. This infamous policy of containment, we're going to snap back hard. Where do they snap back hard? Well, they focus on our allies. We're a big and unruly thing for them to kind of push around, although they do try. But they put our allies in their crosshairs. President Putin has presided over the development of new Russian military strategy, which is all about, Russian military strategy distinguishes three types of war: local war, think Chechnya; regional war, think NATO or China; major all-out war for the survival of the Russian state. And they've put 25 years of intellectual energy on that middle problem. And in the last few years under Putin have finished a complete rewriting of their doctrine. And the whole strategy is blackmail and brinkmanship against the US-led alliance in order to separate the allies from the United States in time of crisis and from each other. They have put nuclear weapons into a much bigger strategic toolkit. The strategic toolkit is also missiles without nuclear weapons on the front. There are cyber tools, there are space attack tools, and they envision the use of these weapons primarily against our allies in order to sober the United States and its allies into recognizing that we've gone too far, and it's time to acknowledge Russia's interest and back down. The defense minister of Russia just a couple of weeks ago gave a speech in which he summarized the results of 10 years of military modernization in Russia. And if you can see the numbers there, they've made substantial progress in deploying new strike systems. That says increased weapons platforms capable of striking Europe by a factor of 30. And of those, and they've increased cruise missiles by a factor of 18, and every cruise missile and most ballistic missile that the Russians build are capable of delivering either a conventional or a nuclear weapon, doesn't matter. In this same 10-year period, NATO has been focused completely elsewhere. Point number one was that Russia and China really don't like our alliances, and point number two is, and they've put together the military strategies and capabilities to go after these alliances in time of war. This is the threat from Iranian missiles to NATO members. You can see that they're capable of credibly threatening an attack on any NATO member in Europe. There are two NATO members not in Europe, Canada and the United States. But Iran is also making progress in that direction. Let's look briefly at Northeast Asia. When we have a map of Japan, we usually put the map on the north-south axis, and it's there next to a big wide ocean. If you live in Japan, it feels different. The way this really came home to me was after my time in the Pentagon, I had the opportunity to spend a few months at the think tank of the Ministry of Defense of Japan in Tokyo. This was 2013, a time of rising anxiety about the North Korean nuclear program and China. And I got taken to a baseball game. Japanese baseball is a little different from American baseball, not least the way the beer is sold in the stadium, but that's another story. After the third beer, my Japanese host said, "You know what I really want to talk to you about," and this is a very Japanese way of doing things, "what I really want to talk to you about is the pit in my stomach. I look at the world around Japan and I see this mounting pressure from China all the time, unrelenting, political, economic, military. I look at these developing missiles in North Korea and nuclear weapons. I look at everything Kim Jong-un says. Kim Jong-un regularly says, if I ever have to employ a nuclear weapon, it's going on to Tokyo first. And we think this is bad blood historically. This is actually an illustration of my prior point, which is to say the defense of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, would be done with military forces already in Korea, but a lot of military forces that are sitting in Japan under a United Nations flag. And their dispatch from Japan to the defense of South Korea was a no-brainer in the 1950s. No risk to Japan. And Kim Jong-un's trying to make it a brainer. You know, you Japanese really want to risk a nuclear weapon going off in Tokyo and 100,000 dead for this country that's not your ally? Why would you want to do that? Don't get involved in this. So this baseball beer drinking friend of mine says we have this pit in our stomach about that. And where, by the way, are you Americans on this map? So rising anxiety as a result of being under target from these neighboring countries. I think I have one more in this spirit. Yes, here's Kim Jong-un reviewing his nuclear targeting plans. What you can't quite see is that this is Austin, Texas. And everybody wondered, why Austin, Texas? Well, it turns out it's not Austin, Texas. They're aiming for its Barksdale Air Force Base, and why Barksdale Air Force Base? Well, on 9/11, when President Bush boarded his plane, he didn't know where to go. Remember, he was in a schoolroom in Atlanta or somewhere, and there was nowhere for him to go, and he went first to Barksdale Air Force Base because they had a runway long enough for the presidential 747, and then he ended up in Omaha at Strategic Command. But so the North Koreans conclude there must be something strategically significant if that's where the president went first. So they target Barksdale Air Force Base. This is another source of Japanese anxiety. So are you Americans going to come to our defense if this is the risk you run? In the Cold War, this was called decoupling. Our allies were very concerned that the Soviet Union, once it gained the ability to threaten the American homeland, we'd just choose to sit out the fight. And then there'd be no fight, there'd just be capitulation. And this is exactly the image that the Japanese and South Koreans and the Poles and the Czechs and the Latvians and Lithuanians have today. This epitomizes a big new problem. So, challenges facing our allies. That Russia and China don't like the alliances, that Russia and China and North Korea have put together military strategies and capabilities that threaten them directly. Third, they're worried about us staying with the program militarily of fixing these problems. This is the North Atlantic Council. This is what's the North Atlantic Council is the ambassadors from the countries that are parties to the North Atlantic Treaty meet almost daily now, and in this conference room and for an hour in Brussels to discuss one thing or another. And NATO had a plan that we helped develop in 2010 for strengthening NATO's deterrence posture, and then after the invasion of Crimea for changing the deterrence posture to deal with this new problem. Stalled out. Not really clear the U.S. wants to lead this activity. Not really clear that, I mean, we plucked the low-hanging fruit off the tree. Now there are a bunch of politically sensitive questions. Nobody wants to address them. Nobody in Washington is pushing them to address them. So do we and our allies keep strengthening our deterrence posture for this new problem or just opt out? And if we, the United States, choose to opt out, our allies are in a pickle. Don't go there yet. Just by way of illustrating the peculiarities of doing this work in an alliance, here's NATO's nuclear planning map. NATO is an alliance by self-definition that has no enemies, maintains nuclear plans against no country, but maintains the ability to plan for nuclear war. How does it do that? Well, there are 6 guys who go to work in a basement every day with this map. Note that there's no Africa. Note that there's a big island nation off to the northwest of the UK. Note that there's some islands to the north of Scandinavia. And these are all assumed to be enemy countries. And so the planning is done on a daily basis. Go conduct 10 nuclear strikes on the island of Glaciria, and they make the plan, and at the end of the day, they drop it in their burn bag. This is how an alliance, this is how our main alliance is dealing with the Russian nuclear threat today. Then our allies have another worry, which is American credibility. Deterrence depends on what Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi, and Mr. Kim believe. Yes, it's in part about our military capabilities, but it's fundamentally in their head, do they believe that if they commit an act of aggression in these regions, we, the United States, are going to be a part of defending our allies or not? And unfortunately, the current president has done and said many things to persuade them, or at least give them evidence, that they can run that risk. Chips are down, we're not going to be there. And part of it is this sort of, in our national security community, nuclear deterrence is still kind of a taboo. Still kind of a Cold War thing. It's still kind of, we're embarrassed by that history and don't really want to come to terms with it and don't want to spend the money. We have avoided nuclear modernization for 3 decades. We've been living off of military capabilities created in the Cold War, and they're just rusting away. But not really clear that we want to spend the money to deal with it. And lastly, the fifth challenge for our allies is that what this administration has asked them to do is sign up for America First. What it's asked them to do is sign up for a vision of strategic competition and rivalry that this administration explicitly says is about gaining superiority. Well, our allies already know where the thumb screws are going to go when Beijing and Moscow get more anxious about American pursuit of strategic supremacy. The allies are in the crosshairs. And they can't turn to their publics and say, we want you to sign up for an arms race that Mr. Trump wants to start with Mr. Putin. It doesn't work that way. So my 3 main arguments are that Mr. Trump has tapped into some enduring considerations and concerns we Americans have about allies and alliances, but he's put some twists on it that I think are unhelpful and unnecessary. Second, there are some good arguments that we should keep allies and alliances, and I've offered you 4 of them. Third, but assuming we keep them, there are some hard challenges here. And let me go back to the analogy of the 1930s and the interwar period, when we weren't up to the challenges. We couldn't decide we wanted to be relevant to the solution. We decided we didn't really want to put together the military capabilities that we needed in the moment. We let largely ideological internal debates drive our national decision-making. We ended up in a mess. And we can either end up in a mess again, or we can do somewhat better. And keeping our alliances healthy is a part of doing something better. So with that, let me hope I've laid enough on the table, and welcome questions.
Okay, so we have several topics that we want you to cover, and I think we're going to start with the one you ended on, which is pulling the thread again on NATO. And here, let's talk about 2 parts to NATO. One is the practical reality. Now, you mentioned, NATO is expanded. We now have countries like Romania, Montenegro, who have joined the nuclear umbrella under NATO. Do you believe at this point that NATO would indeed invoke Article 5 and go to war to support one of the smaller countries if they were threatened? And then the second part of this is you mentioned sort of an antiquated planning horizon for NATO. Looking at the world maps are always in the eye of the beholder, right? So NATO's map, it looks very skewed with a whole lot of parts of the world that aren't actually there. What would a more modern NATO plan look like if they were to do it every day?
Well, a more modern NATO plan would begin with having a NATO strategy towards Russia, which it does not have. It would begin with having a And by that I mean an overall high-level political military strategy. What is it we're after with Russia? Why didn't the partnership deal of the 1990s and early 2000s work? What are we trying to protect ourselves from with Russia? What are we trying to build with Russia? NATO hasn't answered any of those questions. It doesn't have a military strategy. Ash Carter, Secretary of Defense, 2016, said the United States had not planned for war with Russia since 1991, and he was reinitiating the planning. Well, if you don't start there, you can't answer the question of what role would nuclear weapons play. So, and just to be clear, NATO depends on the strategic nuclear forces of its 3 nuclear-armed members, the United States, Britain, and France. And NATO also has nuclear sharing arrangements, meaning there are 6 countries who fly fighter aircraft that are capable of delivering nuclear bombs. And if there were ever a nuclear war, we would do that together. And the whole point of that is to signal to Mr. Putin or whoever might challenge the alliance that they can't possibly contemplate just picking off one country and winning a war against it. You attack one of us, you're attacking all of us. And this goes to the answer to your second question. There's abundant polling evidence to indicate that in many countries there would be political opposition to protecting Latvia if it's the only country attacked. Look, the premise of NATO in the Cold War was if the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact at their height had 196 armored combat divisions. They don't have 2 today. 196 lined up, prepared to come through a particular gap in the mountains between East and West Germany. There was no way that if they came through the gap, they were stopping in the next county. They were going to keep going to the Atlantic Ocean. So an attack on one, so for the alliance to say an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all was obvious. Now, if a bunch of little green men take part of Latvia and say, okay, we're stopping here, is Portugal going to think that's, no. Lots of countries are going to say, we don't have a dog in this fight. Until you say, well, what exactly is the fight? Is the fight over that little piece of territory, or is Mr. Putin trying to show that this is an alliance that no longer stands for what it says? And is it the principle or the territory that's at issue? They all depend on the principle. Mm-hmm. We all depend on the principle. And I think Mr. Putin, if he were to attack any one member of the alliance, would quickly discover that all of the debate would evaporate, and we would come together, we would rally around the need to defend any one country that's been attacked.
Excellent, thank you. Brad, let's continue on NATO for just one more question, which is what constitutes stop? When we say stop, what constitutes stop? So recognizing that Ukraine isn't in NATO, but Russia came in, they took Crimea. Is there anything at this point stopping them from moving on the rest of Ukraine? And what does stop mean when we say, okay, that's enough, we draw the line in the sand? What does it mean in terms of countries in and around Russia's immediate sphere?
Well, I don't think we've drawn a line in Ukraine. We said, gosh, we'd like you to not go further. We'd say it would trouble us mightily. But that's right. Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty. Some of its leaders and some of its people would like it to be at some point. Some people in NATO have wanted it to be, many have not. And this creates an inherent asymmetry of interests that we can't wash away. This gives Mr. Putin a free hand. Now, what he's also discovered, so part of Mr. Putin's strategy is to surround, so remember post-1945 Yalta Agreement, big buffer zone. Russia's a continental power. It doesn't like to have, it wants a buffer. It doesn't want other countries with a lot of power coming up right onto its border. And the Yalta Agreement gave it the thumbs up to put the people of Eastern Europe under its thumb. It had its buffer zone. It's now trying to recreate that buffer zone by creating, quote, frozen conflicts. situations that just don't get settled. You remember the Georgia War of 2008, a brief little war? Well, it's still going on. We just don't pay much attention to it. The list goes on. There are 7 of them around Russia's periphery. And this both gives Russia the buffer it wants, but it sends boys home in body bags. It's a quagmire. Where's the exit point? Mr. Putin, this is not a winning strategy for Mr. Putin. So to try to take, so there's a part of Ukraine, Crimea, where you could see that people were largely sympathetic to being a part of modern Russia. But there's a lot of Ukraine where the people are not sympathetic. And were he to try to formally, by military means, occupy, conquer, and rule that part of Ukraine, he would find a quagmire that would be very costly. I think it's unlikely that he would do that. And I think for NATO to draw a red line and say, don't you dare, is simply not credible.
Interesting. So let's move to the other side of the world. Okay, so you set us up with the 2 big adversaries who want to be world powers, obviously Russia and China. So I could simplify the questions on this to what about China? But let me dig a little bit further. What do alliances really look like? We know what NATO looks like. We fought a world war. We built these alliances. We came out. We have a very structured policy in NATO. What's comparable? What does it look like for countering China?
Well, it's not going to look anything like that. I mean, first of all, so NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty, and it is 30 countries or 29. It's a multilateral organization. Our alliances in East Asia are not. They're separate bilateral alliances. We have an alliance with Japan. We have an alliance with South Korea. Japan and South Korea are not allied with each other. This creates both more flexibility for us, but also is part of a problem for us. If we were to try to build a formal multilateral alliance around China, we would find most of those current allies would say, thank you, no. Because they live with China. They're in the neighborhood. They don't want an Iron Curtain. They don't want to look to a future that's increasingly intense military competition. They want to integrate China into something that they can all live with. So we and our allies are going to have separate means to deal with the military threat presented by Chinese military capability. But it's not fundamentally a strategy of containment. It's a strategy of protection and trying to balance cooperation and competition with China. And to take a slightly different cut in closing to your question, Russia and China present similar but in many ways quite different problems for us. They're similar in the sense that they contest our influence. They don't like the world we've tried to create. They don't like us. And they see putting us at risk as inducing a restraint that we Americans don't normally exercise. That said, Russia's power today is at its peak, and it's going to decline from here on out. This has to do with demographics, economics, political reform, economic reform, et cetera. And so some people say we don't need to worry about it very much. Well, it could be a prolonged decline and an ugly decline. So I'm not in favor of not worrying about Russia. But there is sort of an iron curtain. When the strategic policy question for the United States in these 2 relationships is, how do we balance cooperation and competition? And with Russia, there's not much cooperation to balance in that mix. With China, we have plenty of both. We have lots of shared interests, economic, in the region, in some global issues. China wants to reform the inherited world order. Putin wants to undermine it and jettison it. You saw the reference on the slide to his statement in 2013, new rules or no rules. That's not China's view. China's rule is just better rules.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, that brings up the important point of cooperation versus coordination against a threat. So let's move away from the traditional world of alliances. You started with an excellent description of where we were 100 years ago and what the 20th century brought us in terms of alliances. But now I'd like you to really think about some different threats, okay? And what do allies and alliances mean facing different threats? Now, the one that you mentioned at the beginning, which is obvious, which is ISIS, or any transnational terrorist organization that operates the way they do without necessarily adhering to what we would consider the traditional rules of war. So what do allies and alliances look like when you're facing a transnational threat?
Well,
Stump the policymaker.
they may have no particular role. So I don't know what the problem, and undoubtedly there's one ahead of us, but I don't know what it might be other than a resurrection of some ISIS-like, or the renewal of al-Qaeda's strategy in some new way, or potentially their acquisition of a nuclear weapon. That would be a shocker. And alliances are the starting point of what you do next. Alliances are the pool that you go to for your posse. They are where you begin building a coalition of the willing. If your allies won't go, if America can't get its allies to go with it on some big project like the war on terror, it's got no prospect of getting somebody else to go with it on those kinds of activities. Alliances are reminders that we have not only common threats, we don't even talk about our alliances really as built anymore around common threats. They're built around common interests, common purposes, common values, and sometimes some common threats.
Good. So since that was tough, let me make it a little harder. We just created SpaceCom. What do allies and alliances look like if we are fighting wars not in the traditional sense, not even against non-nation states, but we're fighting cyber wars or wars in outer space? What then?
I'm sorry, Maureen, that's an easy one. The allies and alliances are pretty much the same, except with the addition of the private sector. So what do I mean by that? So I run a research center at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and we do 8 two-day workshops a year, and we recently did one on this question. And the way we posed the question was, so we now have a national military strategy for war in space. What's our strategy for space in war? To which the answer was, oh, that's a good question. Because the space community has talked to the space community, like the cyber community talks to the cyber community, like the nuclear community talks to, like the missile defense community talks to itself. The reality is, if there's ever a war in space, it's because there's a war on the surface of the Earth. There's something else going on that expands into space, that expands or begins in cyberspace. And it's not as if the problem of conflict out there is separated from the problem of conflict here. Not as if the problem of cooperation out there isn't separated. So if there's a war in space, whose assets are being attacked? Everybody's. There's no, you attack a satellite in space today, what are you attacking? What's being carried on that satellite at that moment? Is it military information? Is it commercial information? Is it China's information? Is it our information? Whose information is that? And if we want to act in that environment, we have to have access to it. This is a place where our allies play a very important role, particularly if in a major war we lose space launch access. Allies may be able to compensate for us. And of course, they provide the same entree to cyberspace if we happen to lose that kind of entree. But in these new domains, cyberspace and outer space, you have the additional partners, private sector. a war in space, to gain access to space 10 years from now is going to be by and large a commercial activity. So there will be commercial actors intimately involved in prosecuting a war. To communicate in space is to communicate with private assets. To attack any satellite and generate debris is to put debris in the orbit of many. So same alliance structures in addition to new partners.
So on that, does that mean NATO takes space planning, defense seriously? I mean, do they engage in that? And if they do, how do they engage in partnership in something that sensitive and that classified with the private sector?
Yes, NATO does. So in 2012, NATO conducted a review of its deterrence and defense posture. All through its history, NATO has said the alliance will maintain an appropriate mix of nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities at the lowest levels consistent with the existing security environment. And in 2012, they said they had the mix was appropriate and it was at the right level. And then came 2014, Russian invasion of Crimea. Whole new problem. And NATO's been had a process underway for getting space capabilities of allied partners into its thinking, and cyberspace as well. And engaging the commercial sector, well, that's sort of, different countries do that differently. In the United States, we have a commercial sector that's been, the Silicon Valley community, the communications technology sectors that began to engage in the national security discussion and process and then got terribly burned with the Snowden revelations and retreated back into their shell and concluded that their interests were not well served by staying inside their shell, and have tried to hire young people coming out of master's program with a little experience in the military or government to create a group of people who are policy fluent, who are strategy fluent, who understand military equities, and are capable to represent the interests of these firms into the policy process, and vice versa, who are able to represent the policy process into the internal discussions in the firms. But this is still very much an ad hoc process, and I think it's going to change a great deal in the coming decade. Excellent.
That's really good insight. Let's shift in this question to understanding an external factor that's very tied to our alliances, and that's the issue of the global economy. So, and the U.S. economy. So, as the U.S. faces potential headwinds, or the global economy faces potential headwinds, the U.S. faces rising debts, changes in policy. How are our alliances affected? Do other countries lose faith in the United States if they sense global slowdown? Maybe as we had during the recession, maybe as what is potentially on the horizon now. How does the economic wherewithal of various countries play into their willingness to be partners and to maintain that partnership as allies and in our formal alliances?
Well, the sense that we have shared interests, which I've hit over and over again in this discussion, includes, of course, the economic interests. And to the extent we, the United States, move in the direction of saying, no, we're not in a win-win situation, but we're in a zero-sum game where the only way we Americans improve is by disadvantaging our allies economically, that goes right to the core of the political understanding of what these alliances are for today. The relative degree of prosperity of the United States, for most allies, not such a big deal. We're still so gigantically more capable of mobilizing wealth than any American ally. That's their main point. But their confidence in our will is what's at issue, not their confidence in our ability. They understand our economy can generate a great deal of wealth and technology. And as I spend a lot of time talking with allies. I do 2 informal trilateral dialogues a year with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. We go to Maui, we drink Mai Tais, we have a nice time, and they say, look, here's what's really going on in our political cultures. And last time it was, the permafrost that defined the East Asian security environment for 70 years, it's not only melting, it's gone. Everything's in motion, and you Americans don't seem to understand that. And twice a year I do a comparable US, UK, French dialogue, and then twice a year I do a NATO-membered informal dialogue. And the messages are all pretty much the same. The Trumps of America come and go. We, your allies, understand that you Americans have a wide-ranging debate, and you're going to go this way one time and that way. But you have, for the period since World War II, come back onto the course you set at the end of World War II. And, we'll survive one Trump term. But will we survive a second Trump term? And it won't be Trump. It won't be because of who's in the White House in that moment. If this is what's become the mainstream of American politics, then there is no longer a political foundation for our alliances. And that will be so if you Americans demonstrate to yourselves that you're incapable of dealing with the problems you have as a society. And you've got plenty of ability to mobilize wealth, but you can't seem to get your federal budget in order. And you can build all sorts of consensus when you're under real pressure to do so, but you never seem to get yourselves to that point. So they see us as still being a country with great potential to lead and with a political culture that wants to exercise leadership, but they're in increasing doubt about our ability politically to solve our national problems. And these alliances will not be here in 10 years if we don't do those things.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to give you one that
Do I get a softball?
You get a softball. You get a softball. You've talked about damage to our alliances on one hand, and particularly on the nuclear side. We've heard from several speakers, Dave Feathers here from the test site, others who have mentioned the buildup in the nuclear weapons program or the investments the U.S. is making in the nuclear weapons side. So we're certainly continuing our commitment, if you will, on the to the nuclear umbrella with renovations and rebuilding of our nuclear infrastructure. On the other hand, we've portrayed some things to the outside world that are confusing to our allies and alliances. So rolling all that together, look ahead. This is your softball, right? This is your, in the world 5 years from now, 10 years from now, pick a number. What will it take for us to have the strength of alliances that got us through long periods of peace, either restored or rebuilt in a different direction?
Well, part of the answer is having answers with our allies to the military problems presented by Russia and China. We need to say more than that we're going to do the right thing in response. We need to be doing the right things in response. And we haven't exactly defined what those are. Secondly, we need to be clearer as Americans about what we think our world role is. I could give you a series of technical answers. There are these capabilities we would need. We need to renew the nuclear force. We need to move into space in a thoughtful way that makes the problem better for us, not worse. We need to compete militarily in cyberspace, again, without making the problem worse than it needs to be. There are a series of sort of technical answers to your question. The high-level question is, do we want to be a part of the solution or not? And we as a nation, I don't think, we had a pretty clear answer to that through the Cold War and through the first 2 decades after the Cold War. And I don't think our answer is very clear anymore. And I don't think it's just by accident that the president's national security strategy doesn't mention the word leadership until so much at the end. People want us to lead. Our allies want us to lead because there are many problems they cannot solve if they're left to solve them on their own. And Russia and China want us to exercise certain forms of leadership as well. And there should be some basis for cooperation even at that level. But if our gut level national reaction is isolationism, withdrawal, and to hell with all of you, you don't pay your bills, go away, we'll end up back in 1939. I mean, recall how we got to World War, which was basically three leaders, three individuals, calculating that even though the democracies were stronger militarily, they could take a reasonable risk of attacking us because it was our will that was weak, not our capability. And we signaled over and over again that our will was weak. Well, it turned out it wasn't. Turned out that democracies, I mean, the theory of the dictator is democracies are weak, they're led by inherently weak people, they're always divided, they're easy to divide, they're paper tigers, you punch them in the face, they're going to go home. Well, we Americans have done that. We've been punched in the face. Marine barracks, Lebanon, 186 Marines. President Reagan brought everybody home. But we're also the America of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And we should not want these three leaders today to calculate what three leaders calculated in 1939. We don't want anyone to mistake our willingness to defend our interests and our values when they're under attack. You punch America in the face, particularly with a nuclear weapon, we're not likely to go home. But we've lost all of that discussion. It's mired in a lot of other things at the moment. And when people ask me what keeps me up at night, I've got a welter of nasty things that I think about in my professional life, but it's our political system is what keeps me up at night.
On that happy note, thank you, Brad, for sharing your insight. It was sobering, but it also made us think, and we really appreciate both and your engagement. And since you are, we will call you a Reno son, please come back. We look forward to having you join us at NSF again in the future. So with that, thank you very much.